3 weeks.
Awesome. We are now recording.
I'm going to click got it just so that it might go away automatically. And I'm now a data scientist at Climate Engine, not presenting on behalf of that group today, but that's where I am. And I consider myself a geospatial data scientist. That's my background, is remote sensing, geospatial data analysis. And so yeah, Beth asked me to be here today, and I'm excited to be here. So I'll be talking about the Rangeland analysis platform, and I think it's a really good way of kind of thinking about how multispectral data from Landsat or other sensors can be used in kind of modeling vegetation. And so I'll be walking through kind of how we do that and kind of some of the outputs in terms of our data and how different folks are using that data. And hopefully this will click.
Oh, sometimes you have to click your mouse in PowerPoint.
Oh, got it.
Make it active.
There it is. Okay, awesome. So to start, I'll give some background on the Rangeland analysis platform. And then I'm going to spend a good bit of time talking about the two core data sets and talking about Landsat data as a satellite platform, how we use Landsat data in machine learning and deep learning models to produce basically maps of vegetation. And then I'll talk about how the data is being applied by different research or different management agencies and in research. And then I'll close with some resources. So yeah, the Rangeland analysis platform. Essentially, there are two components to the Rangeland analysis platform, or the RAP. I should mention that the RAP is the brainchild of two researchers at University of Montana, Brady Allred and Matt Jones. I've been associated with it for about 1.5 years. They've been working on it for about 5 years or so. And there are kind of two primary components. And the first is spatial data. And so those are vegetation data sets. Vegetation cover and rangeland production are the two primary data sets. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today in a lot of this talk. And then the other is web applications. And web applications are really important here because these are huge data sets. They cover all of the continental US, 35 years of data. And so to be able to really glean insights from that data set, otherwise you'd need to be a spatial data specialist. We want people who are in management decision-making, don't have technical geospatial backgrounds to be able to get powerful insights from these data sets. And so that's where we use web applications. And so, as I mentioned, there are two primary RAP data sets, and each of them heavily use Landsat data. And so Landsat is a satellite program jointly operated by the USGS and NASA. It's been in operation for the last 50 years and for nearly the last 40 years in kind of a comparable manner. And what's fantastic about Landsat for vegetation analysis is that it revisits the same location over 20 times per year. And so, you think about how much vegetation changes over the course of a year, having that repeat visit time is really valuable, of course. And then it's been in operation for nearly 40 years. So it's just a huge archive of vegetation data, really unlike anything else that is available. And so it's really powerful for building our data sets off of. And so as I mentioned, both of the data sets I'll talk about today, vegetation cover and rangeland production, rely on Landsat. And some of the other strengths of Landsat are it's a 30-meter spatial resolution. What that means is that each pixel in a Landsat image is 30 meters by 30 meters on the ground. So it measures roughly the size of the infield of a baseball diamond. That's how we commonly think of it. And for vegetation analysis, that's perfectly reasonable for a resolution. Other, intelligence purposes, things like that, you might want a finer resolution. But for vegetation, that's fantastic. And then, of course, having that depth of the time series going back from present day to 1984 in a comparable manner, being able to have 40 years of data to draw on that repeat visit time, the 16-day temporal resolution. So basically it revisits the same location every 16 days. And then I think it's important to remember with Landsat that, you see an image and think, oh, it's collecting pictures of the Earth. And that's true, but it's also collecting a lot of other different types of information about the environment. So it's collecting essentially measurements of reflectance in the red, green, and blue portions of the electromagnetic spectrum that we're used to seeing as humans, but it's also capturing other types of energy that are reflected from the Earth's surface that are really important for understanding plants and how plants are changing through time. And so while there are fantastic similar sensors available, the Landsat is really unique in a lot of regards. And so the first data set that I'll talk about here is our vegetation cover data set. And so this is a data set that uses Landsat, and I'll explain how we use Landsat to produce this data set. But essentially, there are 5 different vegetation classes: perennial forbs and grasses, annual forbs and grasses, shrubs, trees, and bare ground. And they're mapped for all of the continental US. And you can think of these maps as they're 30 meter by 30 meter pixels, just like Landsat. And we're mapping percent cover. So for each pixel in this map, it's a map of 0 to 100% in terms of percent cover. So these areas in here are, dark green, and they're somewhere 75% cover perennial forb and grasses. This data set is available at an annual time step. So right now, this is just showing 2021, but you can imagine these maps for every year from 1986 through 2021. So it's 36 years of data at this point. And like I said, it's a 30-meter spatial resolution. And so where we start to use Landsat is in producing this data set. And so there are 2 primary inputs into our model. The first is field information, field vegetation information. And so this comes from actual crews that have gone into the field for the Bureau of Land Management, the NRCS, National Park Service, collected field data in a comparable manner so it can all be used side by side. And that provides essentially a wealth of information about vegetation communities on the ground. We're then able to pair that with satellite imagery from the Landsat program. So 36 years of Landsat data. And then the real trick here is having, being able to essentially identify relationships between the satellite imagery and the field vegetation data that we're actually interested in on the ground. And so that's where platforms like Google Earth Engine and just Google Cloud overall have been invaluable for producing data sets like this. And so that's what we do. That's been really over the last 5 years or so. That's kind of revolutionized what's been possible in terms of models like this. And so ultimately, then we're able to, by identifying these relationships with machine learning models, then we're able to use the satellite data to make predictions across all of the continental US for every year going back to 1986, even for locations that we don't have field data. And so this valuable field data helps us to basically produce a data set anywhere you would want it for 36 years. And so these are machine learning and deep learning models. And I'll be kind of walking through here a little more detail about how we actually produce these. And so this is the 3rd version of the Rangeland analysis platform. The first version was very similar to what I just described. So we had field data. It might be hard to see in the back, but 31,000 plots, so somewhat fewer plots of field data for each of the vegetation types. And then we used 215 total satellite and kind of environmental variables to as inputs into the model to make those then predictions for those predictions across our area of interest. So we used, in that case, a machine learning algorithm called random forest that's really useful in these types of applications. There are a variety of different machine learning algorithms out there, and they're powerful for making predictions like we were, for analyzing kind of how important a lot of different variables are for whatever you're interested in modeling. It has some limitations as well. And so with random forest, you're essentially training up these decision trees. So a bunch of different decision trees, that's where the random forest concept comes from. And then it's averaging all of those predictions. And so it's for any location, yeah, it's probably maybe hard to see this too in the back, but it's a forest essentially with 100% more or less tree cover and 0% perennial forb and grass cover. The model this model is basically, has difficulty predicting those really high and really low vegetation values using the inputs. And the reason is because it's doing all of this averaging. And so at the time, this was really powerful. It was still able to tell us, well, using satellite imagery, using environmental variables, the model thinks, well, there's a lot more tree cover here than there is perennial forb and grass cover. And that was really useful at the time, but was a limitation because it couldn't really represent that ecosystem. And so in the next versions of this model, basically Matt and Brady used a more advanced algorithm. This would be considered a deep learning model. And this was a huge leap forward because it can just much better represent, it's very common to have 100% tree cover in the environment. We want the model to be able to make that prediction. And so this model much better represents variability of the different vegetation types. It can also account for interactions between different vegetation types, like competition that can occur in these ecosystems. And it's only using the satellite data. So all those environmental variables are gone, and it's just using the satellite data. So let me show you what that looks like of how it's just using the satellite data. So I'm going to get rid of this. And this is essentially what would be called a temporal convolutional network. What that means is that basically all that is being given to the model is the Landsat data. So it's just giving the model the satellite data, no more the environmental variables. And then by giving it images at different times of the year, the model is essentially able to recognize, like I said, these vegetation types change a lot throughout the year. And so annual forbs and grasses will green up in the spring and brown down by the time it gets to midsummer. Because we just give the model this temporal data, this time series data, it's able to see, oh, when it's dead in the winter and then greens up in the spring and then browns down in the summer, that's an annual forb and grass. And then trees behave much differently. A tree like a juniper is going to be relatively even throughout the year. And so essentially it's able to use the information that we give it from the satellite imagery to make these predictions in a much more powerful way. So that for this area that was a forest where the previous model struggled to be able to really pick up those really high values of tree cover, really low values of herbaceous cover, the new model, version 2 and 3, is able to do that in a much more realistic way. And so it's really able to represent that environment in this really powerful kind of way. And so that's a whirlwind tour of the vegetation cover data set. The next one is rangeland production. And so here we're mapping two different vegetation types: perennial herbaceous plants, so perennial forbs and grasses, and annual forbs and grasses. But here, instead of percent cover, we're modeling productivity. And so each of these pixels then represents some value between 0 and I think like 8,000 pounds per acre is the maximum in this data set. And this data set is also available annually. So you can analyze trends over many different years in this data set, which is great. And then you can also, because it's available every 16 days within any given year, you can also look at essentially when did things start to green up? When did production start to take off? How does this year compare to previous years? And this is really kind of was a huge advance in kind of rangeland monitoring and modeling when this came online because of that ability to really see how things are changing within a given year. And so this data set is also from 1986 to present day at a 30-meter spatial resolution. And I'm actually going to skip most of this slide, but essentially I'm not going to cover this diagram here because it's complex and I would get into trouble if I tried to talk about it because it's a complicated model that I was not involved in. But if you just think back to before in the vegetation cover data, we were using these machine learning models to find relationships between kind of two different data sets, the satellite data and the field data. Here, what this complicated diagram is showing you is basically a way of representing the process of biomass production using data. And so it's considered a process model. And so if we just think about the types of things that control how plants put on biomass, I think it'll make sense. And so some of the key inputs in this model are just vegetation covered. Different vegetation types produce biomass differently. And so we actually use the vegetation cover data that we just talked about directly in the model to represent ecosystems. And then we use satellite measurements of absorbed solar radiation. Of course, that's just photosynthesis. If plants are, actively absorbing solar radiation, then they're absorbing the sun's energy. They can produce plant biomass. And then plants need moisture and temperature to be able to grow. And so in some ways, it's a pretty simple model, just trying to represent an ecosystem with data. And it's actually been in use for 50 years in ecology. This is called a light use efficiency model. That's not important, but just to say that this has been around for 50 years. And now with some modern twists that we're able to accomplish using satellite data. And so it's been pretty straightforward to measure absorbed solar radiation using satellites for a long time. If folks have been in a remote sensing class, NDVI is kind of a common index that's used for this. It's just a measure essentially of vegetation greenness. And so essentially there are really like dirt simple ratios that you can use to be able to measure this using satellites. The challenge has always been representing vegetation types in a realistic kind of way. And so, just thinking about different types of vegetation, and I'm not going, again, these are like just to say that each of these vegetation types needs different kind of, to be represented differently in the model. So we don't need to get hung up on what any of this represents. But the point is they need to be represented differently. And up until really this kind of iteration that we're talking about here, to represent ecosystems, you had to use a categorical data set like NLCD, which is a great data set, but has limitations because you have to classify each location as one type of land cover. And so like this image here shows kind of a mixed vegetation type. So you can't really call it just a grassland or a shrubland. And you would ordinarily with this model. With the RAP, we take a complicated landscape like this one in northern Wyoming, where the previous model would have said, oh, this area is all trees, this is all shrubland, and this is some grassland here. We're essentially able to kind of represent the predominance of these different vegetation types in a very nuanced kind of way, so that the model is then able to say, oh, there's 30% perennial herbaceous cover, 40% tree cover, and 10% shrub cover, and it makes its calculations accounting for that vegetation community. And so the vegetation cover data set is really this is the big leap forward here in being able to represent these vegetation types. And so basically using meteorological, climate data, vegetation cover, and NDVI, the vegetation greenness, along with a bunch of other fancy things that we're not talking about, we're able to produce a data set like this. And it just wouldn't be possible, as you can see, without satellite data. There's just no other way to scale something like this to such a large area. Okay.
Quick question.
Yes.
How accurate is the specific vegetation cover with 30-meter resolution?
Yeah. So there are different ways that we validate these models, and so that's what they're asking about with the accuracy. It's different. So we validate each vegetation class differently. On our website at rangelands.app, you can go to the products page, and there's basically a bunch of information there that'll link to, it has actually the tables of the accuracy assessment statistics, and then we'll also link to the peer-reviewed publications for each of these as well. So those are the two data sets. And now, in terms of what you wanted, there's the producing the data, and then there's all the motivation for why one would want to produce data sets like this. And that's to really move conservation and research forward in a meaningful way. And so that's where we really rely on web applications. And what that allows us to do, this is a screenshot from our website. You can go to rangelands.app and check out these different apps. But essentially what these apps allow us to do is take what is kind of an abstract, two data sets that it may not be immediately obvious how a land manager would want to use these data sets, and to kind of cater how they're presented, how they're summarizing data for different folks. And so we have our main RAP data application that allows you to just explore the data as it is. We have the Production Explorer, which is really catered towards kind of sustainable ranching. We have a cheatgrass application that just focuses on annual invasive grasses across the West and that issue. And then we have some scientific data sets that are built on top of the RAP to estimate fire probability across rangelands, things like that. I think I saw a question.
Yeah, and are all these products free on your website?
Yeah, they're totally freely available. So they're funded by agencies, and it's really important for us to be able to make them free because resource managers don't always have money to pay for data sets like this. And so it's really catered towards making it easy and free to use. Yeah. And so, yeah, I just put this logo here because for folks who use R, I've actually created a few different data tools that use this R Shiny framework. And so you can make really cool tools that scale to a lot of different users really well. And so an example of how we're able to use these web apps is this is a screenshot of a web app for the Bureau of Land Management. It might be a little hard to see, but there are a lot of kind of land units represented here in shades from green to brown. And these are depicting for BLM grazing allotments, every one of the 22,000 BLM grazing allotments, how things are trending in terms of herbaceous production using the rangeland production data set. And so areas depicted in green are showing a positive trend. Areas depicted in brown are showing a negative trend. And areas that are more just white are more just kind of level. They're changing a whole lot one way or another through time. And so what this application then allows folks to do is then click any allotment that they're interested in and see how things are trending in that allotment. And so I clicked this one because it's kind of a weird one. You can see it's like a bluish green shade surrounded by a bunch of other more downward trending allotments. And so within the app, then we allow folks to compare how this allotment is trending to how the broader area, the whole field office is trending. And so you can kind of start to dive in and tease out, well, are things trending differently in this one local area than over the whole, area that we're interested in, and well, what's causing that, and get into some management questions in that way. Another application is, I mentioned our sustainable ranching tool. And so we have a way, basically this tool takes the production data, the rangeland production data, and allows the user to put in a bunch of information about their grazing operation, and then to generate reports of, some guidance in terms of what a proper stocking rate might be given that amount of production. And so they can say, how long they want livestock to be out on a given land unit, and a bunch of other kind of grazing specific information that they would know how to use, and then to produce this estimate. And then we allow the ability to export that data as a report. So agency folks can then literally print that out, take it into the field, and go talk to landowners or whoever they might be working with in creating grazing plans. And so literally taking, these complex satellite models and translating them all the way through to Excel sheets that people can print out and take into the field to be able to use kind of operationally. And so that's, I think, pretty much what I have to mention. We do make our data available publicly. So you can access it through our web apps. You can also access it programmatically. And so we do have an API, which just means that you are able to essentially be able to access the data remotely for any area you might be interested in. If we have any Earth Engine users, both the vegetation cover and the rangeland production data are available as Earth Engine assets. So that's totally public. You can really start kind of playing around with these data sets. You can actually find the Earth Engine team at Google has used this data set for some tutorials before, so they like it enough that they're able to use it as for some examples. So really encourage you, if you're learning Earth Engine, to go check that out. And yeah, in terms of next steps for folks who might be interested in kind of going from out of this into some courses or whatever that might set you up to be able to produce models like this or do more remote sensing, you can check out our website at rangelands.app. There are some fantastic Earth Engine tutorials from Peter Engelstad and Dan Carver. Dan Carver is now at the Geospatial Centroid for using Google Earth Engine for natural resources, which are really great. There are a bunch of different courses that you can take. I lean towards the data science stuff. And so like Beth's programming and GIS class is a really fantastic one for being able to put that on your resume. I know remote sensing, at least this semester, is being taught in Google Earth Engine. Matt Ross's watershed science classes, watershed science classes are taught in R. And so you can start to kind of dig into these programming languages just kind of bit by bit, and it can be really fun. So if you're thinking about learning some programming, these are some great ways to get started. And of course, if you're done with courses, you can find a bunch of stuff online, because that's where I go mostly now that I'm out of school. And so with that, yeah, thanks very much, and happy to have some discussion with, hopefully I didn't go too long.
No, even a little under.
Oh, wow.
What you were thinking.
Okay. So we've got lots of time.
We got lots of time. Thank you. What questions do we have? And if you're on Zoom, you can either put it in the chat or just unmute and talk to.
Yeah, Jeremy.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
At what scale, so I know this is a 30 meter by 30 meter pixel resolution. What's the finest scale that you would encourage land managers to analyze their land, though? So I don't think going down to 30 meter by 30 meter would be so realistic, or would be so precise.
No, that's a great.
So what would the smallest land unit be that you would encourage people to think about if they're thinking about change over time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we get that one a lot. And there are, I think where that comes from, there are a lot of data sets and programs where, because of the modeling approach, they want you to kind of summarize over these larger areas, because it helps to kind of avoid, well, this model was wrong, because there is error associated with any model, right? We really encourage people to use it at any land unit. Part of the value of this type of modeling approach is that the models are producing predictions on a pixel by pixel basis. And so it's kind of nuanced. There's, the error can be kind of more, the error gets averaged out over a larger area. But at the same time, our models are able to account for kind of, these different vegetation types well enough that they're, that's the scale that the predictions are made. That's the scale they're validated at as well. And so, we always encourage people to not take these outputs as gospel, because they're from a model, and you have to, you shouldn't just take that number as what you think that system is and then get mad when it doesn't match up with what you think, your pasture or whatever actually is in terms of vegetation. Yeah, long way around the barn. You can use it at any scale that you want, and we encourage people to do that. And yeah, we try to address that same question proactively, because it comes up a lot. Yeah.
We have a question from the Zoom chat. Is there a possibility that you can integrate Sentinel-2 imagery into the models, and what would be the limitations on the number of bands?
Yeah, so Sentinel-2 is a similar program to Landsat. It's designed to be comparable, but it's at a finer spatial resolution and has some other bands that are valuable for vegetation. I know that Brady and Matt had considered using that. One of the limitations of just using Sentinel on its own is it just doesn't go back in time as far. And that's important both in terms of, how much time you can look at vegetation over, as well as we train our models using field data from 2004 to 2021. And you have to match that to the satellite data. And so if Sentinel's only from 2015 to 2021 or 2022 now, then you can't use really that same satellite or that same training data quite as easily. So yeah, I think there would probably be some value there, especially, as Sentinel gets older and older with each passing year. And, but unfortunately, I kind of have to punt a little bit on that one, because it's more of a question for Brady or Matt on the modeling side.
Caitlin?
Yeah.
Is the R code for any of the Shiny apps public on GitHub or anything?
It's not. I mean, I'm happy to just talk about, some of the code, or I can share, privately share some code here and there as well. Unfortunately, we don't make it all publicly available. We may revisit that at some point here soon. But I am, try to toe the line between, wanting everything to be available and be able to help and support and help people access it. And then also like recognizing that there's some value to keeping things behind the scenes sometimes. So yeah, happy to have conversations offline about Shiny apps and things like that.
And then second question, are all of these data products, I'm assuming they're large at 50 meter resolution, are they all stored via Google Earth Engine, or what are your other data storage methods?
Yeah, so they're all, they are on a server as well at University of Montana. So I think our downloads are managed through a server at University of Montana. The data sets themselves are on Google Cloud. And so, that's how we're able to use them in Earth Engine. And they're large, especially with the 16-day data. I think it's 50 terabytes of data at this point. So it's a lot. Yeah. Which is exactly why we rely on Google Cloud, because, we wouldn't be able to produce these models otherwise. And for people to be able to use them, there would just be no other way, really. So.
What other questions do you have? I know many of you are more on the beginner end, so if you have more beginner questions, that's totally okay too.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Someone was just about to ask one on Zoom.
Yeah, it was me. Eric, I wanted to ask if the web services are able to be shared, like I see they're available online, if others can use them, as well as the data I see is of course shared.
Sorry, which surfaces?
The web services. So you have a whole bunch of tiles being generated. I guess they're stored on Google Earth. If someone wanted to consume your web services, like their web map services in their own web app, is that something that would be doable?
Yeah, they're web map tile services. So you can't use them quite as, they don't generalize quite as well. I think like with an actual web map service, you'd be able to clip them and do some more kind of custom stuff. But if you go to our support site and search web services, you'll find ways to bring those web services into GIS or into a web application. And that's a really good one. That's actually a really good point, because a lot of times people want to bring in the data sets to be able to just have in a map, in ArcGIS, and it can be cumbersome to download them. It's just challenging for a variety of reasons. And so these web map tile services, you can just bring them in and have just images of all of the data that you can bring into GIS with, just a couple of clicks to do that. You can't analyze them that way, but you can make a map, which can be useful for going out into the field or any number of things. So great question. Does that answer it?
Yep, definitely.
Cool. Yeah.
So with the field data that you're comparing to the satellite data to kind of compare over that, what kind of field data is it specifically?
Yeah, so it's essentially, it's from the BLM's AIM program, NRCS, National Resources Inventory Program, and the National Park Service's Northern Colorado Plateau Network. And so they essentially run transects. And so they go to any location, all those locations on the map. They have, it's called a spoke design. So they run 3 to 4 transects, I think it is, and then literally drop pins every half a meter to a meter and collect 150 vegetation, points. And with every pin drop, they're identifying, the specific species of shrub, the specific species of forb, whatever it hits on the way down, or just bare ground if it hits that. And so basically using that, fortunately, these programs summarize them by the different plant types. And so we just use the information on plant types in terms of percent cover of, if shrubs were hit on 30 of 150 points, then you've got 20% shrub cover.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's the BLM started collecting, these agencies started collecting data about 10 years ago in this comparable way. And one of the reasons was to facilitate remote sensing applications, and it's working. So they're really awesome data sets to have.
Okay, I can see where that would make for a really easy comparison doing it that way.
Yeah. And we're a small team. It's just a couple of researchers. If every hurdle in terms of data processing makes it just that much harder to produce something like that. So yeah, awesome. Yeah.
What does the software do on days when there's lots of cloud cover in the Landsat imagery? Does that drop the whole day, or does it kind of view around the clouds?
Yeah, so it'll there are cloud masks basically that are applied to remove clouds. So a lot of times parts of images will be cloudy and you can use other portions of the images. And I think that's where in a lot of rangelands across the West, we can get away with that because it's a lot drier than tropical forests where they have a really hard time using sensors like Landsat because it's just cloudy a lot in a lot of environments. And so because especially as you get further west, it tends to be more arid and less cloudy. We are a little bit lucky there. It definitely helps now. Right now there are, I think actually 3 satellites up there, Landsat 7, 8, and 9 that are all operational. So we can get, now there are upwards of 60 observations per year rather than, 20 or so. And so, hopefully you just get lucky. And then there are ways kind of built into the production model, especially for dealing with missing images. So yeah.
We have 2 questions from the chat.
Sweet.
If you were going to create a custom info product for land managers on a per pasture basis, would you use R Shiny and the API or Earth Engine? That's part 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you think they are equal or are there important differences?
Yeah, so I think there are definitely a lot of important differences. And so, so one of the challenges with that, and so basically the way we handle that in some of our apps are like we allow a user to upload 1 polygon at a time and through the Shiny app. And then it hits that API that I talked about, that way of getting data for that custom area and returning it and producing a bunch of plots. And so to me is great for that. I'm not a web developer, so even better would be to hire a web developer. And for the main wrap web app, that's what we do. Yeah, no, that's all good. And for the main web app, that's what we do is hired a web developer to produce that. So that's really best because there are some limitations with Shiny. But yeah, I think Shiny has some more flexibility in terms of data visualization and things that you can do once you've accessed the data. Earth Engine's kind of a powerhouse for doing raster analysis. So I think it really depends on, it's kind of hard because, different managers will want something very different. And so catering one app towards all land managers is kind of hard. But yeah, I think, might be able to continue that one over email or something and could get a little bit more specific answer there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep.
So you talked about looking at vegetation trends and patterns from data from the past. Do you know how vegetation predictions are made?
So yeah, I know that's something that our group has started on, is trying to make predictions. I mean, it's a whole nother challenge for sure. Especially, it's very hard to make climatological and weather predictions. And then because vegetation responds to those climatological and weather predictions, I think it becomes really hard at that, like that challenge is compounded at that point. Yeah, we always say if you could, predict vegetation you'd just be like, we'd absolutely love to be able to do that. But it's a big challenge for sure. And yeah, I could see in the next 10 years, with some of the approaches that are advancing, there being some real strides in that.
I'm working on a project right now where I'm looking at the vegetation of, where I'm looking at sagebrush in 2050, 2080, and just trying to figure out the habitat fragmentation within it and how it's going to affect some of the animals.
Totally. And yeah, I think a lot of it depends, just what you're trying to predict. If you're trying to predict production in pounds per acre, or, that's kind of what we would do. That's a different challenge from predicting, well, will it be an above or below average year this year? And that's a totally different challenge from, what will things be like in another 60 years? But yeah, I think forecasting is really exciting, and there's tons of stuff going on right now. So it's a great one that we get asked about a lot. Yeah.
There's one more question from the chat, which is a great question, which I wanted to ask you to share anyway.
Cool.
But that is about your path. So you have a really cool job that you just landed
Sure.
right now. And we met 4 years ago when you were getting ready to start your master's here.
Yeah.
You had a lot of cool stuff in between. So can you share with our budding and maybe about to graduate students a little bit about grad school and careers and skills and
Totally
what you've done?
Yeah. So
3 minutes or less.
yeah. So I guess I'd start with I had kind of a cool job. So I was a geography undergrad. So I graduated with my undergrad in 2010. Took 7 or so years in between my undergrad and graduate school. Worked for different federal agencies, kind of figuring out what I wanted to do. I was a contractor. I did AmeriCorps for a couple of years, kind of figuring out where I wanted to go. And ultimately, I was able to find my way into a geospatial data position that I basically realized that I could do a lot of really cool stuff if I had more expertise and more skills. I'd taken GIS classes in undergrad, but I didn't really have quite the experience I thought I needed to really do well in that position. And so that was a big motivation to go back to school. And I basically used graduate school. I did a master's in ecology here and basically used it as trade school, where I focused on remote sensing, spatial modeling, ecological modeling classes, and just said, I think this is what I want to do, and went down that path. I did NASA Develop for a term. If you're interested in remote sensing and maybe have taken remote sensing, that's a great program where you can work on 10 weeks on these really cool projects that make a real impact and do some really good networking. I was an intern at the Centroid during my master's, and so that was really good experience as well, just working on different projects. And then, yeah, I ended up being able to go to University of Montana. That was, I kind of realized after working with some teams that were doing really cool work, but had unrealistic work expectations, that the team that I was going to be working on was going to make a huge difference in my quality of life. And it wasn't just about doing cool work. And so I, was able to find a team I really liked at University of Montana. And then once I wanted to make this leap to Climate Engine, where I am now, I had a really supportive team around me. And so, just kind of building it step by step and following your interests and passions and, talking to people like Beth or, other graduate students or other people who can be mentors about, to get an idea of what you want to do. And for me, that's been really, really helpful. And just, yeah, kind of figuring out what I want to do when I grow up. We're all kind of doing that all the time.
You might be there.
Yeah, but it's, yeah, I'm excited for sure. But yeah, interests change through time. And
Yeah.
will I want to be in a data scientist role forever? I don't know. I'm really excited about that now, but just following that path, developing a skill set that's useful and that you're passionate about is the most important thing.
We should have you come back in like 6 months and speak to class once you have more experience with your current position, and we can hear all that cool stuff here.
Yeah, that's the hard thing. I get asked about Climate Engine and I'm like, I don't totally know what we do just yet.
Yeah, well, it is 4:51, so officially we are out of time. Do you have a few minutes in case anyone has more questions?
Totally. Yeah, no, I'm
So
not.
you can stick around, but we are officially going to dismiss you. Thank you again, Eric, for coming out in person.
I know.
And thanks to all the NR 493 and NR 322 Geospatial Centroid folks for joining us today. For NR 493, we have these seminars every week. Sometimes they're just regular class, but on April 11th, we're going to have an R versus Python discussion panel and battle royale. And Caitlin will be one of our panelists. And we have 2 other fantastic panelists for that day. So R versus Python, April 11th. And then getting on the career thing, the last day, May 2nd or whatever that May 2nd is, we're going to have a grad student showcase with 3 people who are in grad school for geospatial. At least 2 of them, I think, will be CSU alums as well. So that'll be really cool too. Plus our other Mondays, every Monday between now and May 2nd. So, all right, thank you very much, and enjoy your day.
Awesome. Thank you.
Beth, can I hop in with a few more questions for Eric if he's still?
Sure.
Yeah.